Hello, it's so good to be here. I wanted to not only welcome you to the webinar, but welcome David. It's so nice to have you here. As Roni mentioned,
good morning.
David has spent nearly 2 decades working with different entrepreneurial ventures. He has a deep love for startup. His background's not just in law, but also certainly in venture. And a little known fact about David is that he is an executive producer at heart, producing experiences sort of more than things. And so this idea of being a storyteller lives deep in his blood. To start off, I wanted to ask you, what is a 6-word story about you that would describe you?
About me. I keep changing my mind what the story will be. The simplest is escaped the law, became venture capitalist. That's but that seems too focused on the specifics of of my path. I think maybe better yet is maniacally focused on helping others grow.
Nice. I went for relentlessly planning for spontaneity and inspiration. There you go. So what I wanted to do is just start off with a little bit of grounding around story. David and I have been playing around with this idea of storytelling for at least the last couple years, but I also teach a few classes on it, and it's helpful to sort of set the stage for the webinar. First, our main goal here is to get you to think about story as an asset for your business. And so if we do nothing else in the next 45 minutes or so, it would be to think of story as an asset. So many of us, I think of data, facts, and figures as the most important things to focus on when driving business. And what I think we would contend is that equally important is your story. And there's at least 4 important stories that every business person needs to have in their portfolio. We'll talk about those. I think the other thing that we hope you get out of it is to think about how do you emotionally connect with your audience. And your audience could be board members. It could be venture capitalists that might invest in you. It might be a talented team, and it might be your customers. So as you go through this webinar, think a little bit about what is the most important audience to keep in mind. Who, as you develop your story, what we're going to hope to do is spark a few ideas of how you can create your own stories. So the way that this webinar will kind of flow is we'll do a brief introduction, and then I'm going to talk to David about some of his experiences with story, particularly from his vantage point. We'll hone in on a few different stories. One is the story to connect you to your audience, to build your team and influence culture, to build your brand in the long run, and to spur innovation. The other thing I'm going to mention is that we'll divide this webinar up into 3 parts. Why stories are important in business. We'll dive into these 4 discrete stories, and then we'll turn it over to you and pull in some Q&A. So let me just set the stage. We're going to define story here as a connected series of events with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it has a specific structure. You can think of it as a journey that moves the listener, and when the listener goes on that journey and you finish the story, they somehow feel different. They are transformed. And one of the reasons they're transformed is the protagonist in the journey is also transformed. So stories are all around us. There's some studies that have shown that, in fact, 65% of our daily conversations are made up of personal stories and gossip alone. So just think about that. We've got 65% of our day-to-day life being filled with small anecdotes and gossip and story, suggesting that as we become storytellers and understand the power of story, we might be able to influence the nature and the outcome of those conversations.
And I'd say that I bet you mine is closer to 80.
Yeah.
And I bet you yours is the same. We're story people. And as you find the power of connecting people with these ideas, you end up using it as a tool for everything. And I certainly use it with my children. I certainly use it in business and sitting in board meetings. So I think that story, as you understand its power, becomes more and more a part of your toolkit.
Yeah, so I'm so interested in that. How would you say, at least as you started to take on this frame, can you give us a few examples of when you use story, either at home or in business?
Well, for sure. I mean, the reality is that, so as a venture capitalist, one of the things I do all the time is go to board meetings. And board meetings, to a certain degree, are these incredibly dull, let's tell you where we are in the business, people present. And as an investor, I'm trying to help the company move along, trying to give my perspective. And so you have two choices. You can say, I really think you should do X. And maybe they think by virtue of the fact that you've invested in them that they'll do those things. But the far more effective thing is to say, I've seen this in the past. I've seen this problem in the past, and so here's how it works. Here are the instances in which it's been powerful, or you've affected change, or you have really gotten burnt if you continue doing this thing. And by telling that tale, by saying, in these other contexts, here's what I've seen, people naturally connect themselves to that circumstance and say, oh, wow, let's not do that. So I was on a call just yesterday, company that's raising money, and they're talking to a set of different investors. And each investor has a different characteristic, and one of them is a very new investor, very new to the business, trying to be very technical. And I said, I've seen this sort of investor before, and it's great when things are working, but when it stops working, let me tell you what happens, and here's the experience. And so you should project this sort of experience on this, this group of investors. And it was like, oh, okay, that's an interesting perspective.
And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to give your audience 2 + 2. So they say 4.
Right.
And the process of giving them 2 + 2 instead of 4, allows them to feel like they're part of the solution, that they're part of the aha. And then when research shows that when people make that inference, they feel more closely connected to the solution rather than just hearing it from you.
And it's funny, at one point in this exact same call, I was quite dictatorial. I was, blah, you need to, this is what I think, and et cetera. And it was so ineffective.
Yeah.
And in the end, I said, and luckily this is a group of people who've worked with me a long time. And in the end, I said, listen, you guys know that I'm just stating this really strongly, but that's not a conclusion. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah.
Right. To try and back off of the I just gave you 4. It's like, no. That was just 2 + 2, I swear.
And absolutely, from a parenting perspective, the dictatorial approach only works for so long.
Yeah,
so then,
exactly.
As a tool, you only have stories to persuade. One of the biggest misconceptions, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that most people think that stories are this big epic thing, right? They're movies, they're Broadway shows, and yet stories can be really small. They can be something as simple as 4 or 6 words. They could be a tweet. They could be just a 3-minute video, 1-minute video. I'm curious, in your experience, are there any short stories that have come across your path where you thought, wow, that short story fundamentally changed the way I thought about this startup? And it wasn't this big, long, epic thing. It was just a short anecdote, story, or narrative.
Well, it's interesting. I met with an amazing entrepreneur the other day, and the first presentation that this entrepreneur did focused on the entrepreneur, and so just the thumbnail of this person's experience was enough to make us think, holy, this person is unbelievable. Like how, because we had all lived these very, sort of privileged lives of going to having running water and having electricity, whatever. And this was an entrepreneur who said, well, I grew up in a home that had no electricity, and our closest town was 100 miles away, and yet he's been a wildly successful technology entrepreneur. And that just is electrifying. That in and of itself is electrifying, right?
So you're falling in love with a protagonist. Like, you feel like you know that person. You see you can imagine their hurdles, their struggles, and they surmounted that.
Absolutely. And I'd say that the truth is, and I'm tested on this all the time, because what happens is I've invested in a dozen companies, and people say, okay, what are you invested in, right? Well, it's not gonna be 20 minutes per company, right? I have about 4 seconds per company. Oftentimes the context for these conversations is I'll be at a party or a business gathering, and people say, so what have you invested in? And I have a very short period of time to describe in a hopefully very compelling way these portfolio of companies. So I've invested in, Rocket Lawyer, which is helping small and medium businesses bring their, get legal resources to transform their businesses, right? If it's 7 sentences, you go, I really didn't care that much about Rocket Lawyer. If you go, it's transforming SMB business with legal resources, great. And so oftentimes having that capacity to really create that, that emotional relationship between a business problem and its solution is really powerful.
Great. So let's dive into 4 different types of stories. Specifically, how storytelling can contribute to a successful pitch. The second type of story that we should all have in our portfolio is the story that really inspires your team, that makes high talent people want to come join your team. The third is, how do you really tell a story that connects to your customer and closes the sale? So many times people think that stories are sort of a softer approach, and yet research shows that it actually allows customers to feel closer to the brand and closes sales. And the fourth story is this one about spurring growth and innovation. So let's start off with one that's in your wheelhouse, a story that seals the deal, that an entrepreneur is trying to pitch to a venture capitalist or an investor. Any examples come to mind?
Well, every pitch has to be a story, right? I mean, anyone who thinks that they're pitching a business and it's not about creating this, this excitement and engagement is going to fail, right? And I often describe my own process as I spend an hour, you're presenting your company, we have a conversation, and then you leave, and then that night I go to bed, and if I lie down in bed and I think about your business, then we're on to something. I might actually fund you. Well, I'm probably not going to be lying down in bed thinking to myself, wow, they've grown from 12 to 2,400 customers. But I might think in my head, oh, wow, I didn't realize that it was such a big problem, the transfer of foreign exchange across markets, and here's how they've transformed that business, right? And so it's creating that story that here is a problem, it's a real problem. Oftentimes it's put in the context of a real company, a real individual, and here is how we've solved that problem. Here's why we think this is an engaging and clever solution that helps lots of people, lots of businesses. Those are the things where you leave and think, okay, that's something that I think is compelling and has scale, and an entrepreneur who understands how to motivate people. So in every instance when I'm pitched on a business, it's a story. First, it's the story of the entrepreneur, and then it's the story of how they came to what they're building. And in fact, even the team question, right? The first thing I ask you when you say, and here's my VP of engineering, and here's my co-founder, whatever, is how'd you meet, right?
Yeah.
Because a collection of people is way less interesting than a collection of connected people who are friends or coworkers or share a fanaticism for Bitcoin or all of these things. So literally in every instance, there has to be some connective tissue that leads you to believe that there's something bigger to this than the collective parts.
And so just to recap, think about why David would be thinking about you lying in bed. Just wanted to recap the big idea there. The other 2 key insights there is that your personal story is so important that essentially we're looking at ourselves as potential protagonists or characters in a story, and people get excited about investing in and participating in people they believe in. Protagonists that are compelling, that are relentless, that are passionate. And so I think taking that perspective into account as you're developing your pitch is so important. What is compelling about you and your story?
So here's a great, just to hit on that a little bit. We have one entrepreneur who left college and joined the women's NBA and played, was a professional basketball player, and described the ways in which that experience of going from high school to college ball to professional ball had affected her thinking about team building and winning and all of that stuff. In the same way that when we're pitched by Israeli entrepreneurs who have all served in the military, they can all tell you the ways in which their military service have impacted the way they're thinking about the business they're creating. And to the point where we can tell you within 5 minutes which thing you did in the military. We know coming in, oh, you were a fighter pilot.
Yeah.
Oh, you were in the intelligence agency, right? Because it's so entwined with what you're building and how you'll build it.
Oh, it's a great example. There's an entrepreneur that I admire a lot. Her name is Shraddha Sharma. She built a startup just in the last 3 years, which has blossomed, and it's because of story. So she was a journalist, et cetera, and she was interviewing entrepreneurs. And instead of basically taking down facts and figures of how they grew their company from 12 to 24%, et cetera, she asked them their stories. And entrepreneurs love to tell their story by and large, and so she would collect those stories. And then she created a repository for those stories. And as a result of taking that very human-centered approach of listening to their stories, she was able to grow her own organization significantly, to the point that the data that she supports and how many people she supports, over 12,000 entrepreneurs in the last couple of years now tell their stories on her platform. I think it's just been amazing. So let's talk about the second type of story, this idea of a story, we're calling it the wiki of your organization, a story that works as an internal fulcrum which your team can stress test business decisions. And this is something that James Buckhouse, a brilliant storyteller himself, in fact, the managing editor at Twitter, sort of describes as one of the more important stories. And it really informs your role, the team's role, and your company's role. And we have a couple of examples on this slide share. But I'm intrigued by this idea that every organization should be able to tell a 4 or 6 word story about themselves, just like how we introduced ourselves. Google's is really simple. It launched with, do no evil, 3-word story, highly efficient. Are there ventures within your portfolio where you can just nail, the 4-word story, so that you don't just, lie in bed thinking about this entrepreneur and why you might want to invest in him and her, but their story is so clear and so simple?
For sure. I've funded this one entrepreneur twice, a guy named Rene Lacerte. And Rene's first company was called PayCycle, and he was creating an online payroll company. And I remember people saying, well, why are you excited about payroll? Payroll is like the most boring and long existing thing ever. But Rene had come from a family, his parents had run a payroll company, he had built payroll within Intuit. He really believed in payroll, but the thing that he came to understand was that by taking payroll and bringing it online, you would enable a whole lot of power to the small business owner, right? To allow them more flexibility, to control their own money, to control their own destiny. And so he looked at it and said, this is how I'm going to help small business owners. I'm going to make their lives better. This isn't about making money. It isn't about a technical solution. It's about giving flexibility back to small business owners whose lives are very hectic and challenged. So PayCycle turned out to be a great business. It was ultimately sold to Intuit for a lot of money. And then he thought, well, what's the next problem? And we've solved payroll. What's the next problem? And the next problem that he went on to solve is this problem of how do you manage your money as a small business owner? How do you manage who you're paying and how you're being paid? And so he has a new company called Bill.com, and Bill.com is about accounts payable and receivable and electronic payments. But to the company, it is about creating a paperless experience to empower small businesses. It's about allowing small business owners to understand their finances in a way that makes their lives easier and makes their businesses better.
That's such a great example. I think of also like Adobe, unleashing creativity in the world, or HP, all around invent. The core story of HP, for example, of 2 guys in a garage in Silicon Valley creating an innovation, that core founding story disproportionately outweighs any other thing that HP could do in terms of acquiring top talent and really cementing why we're here. I think this also makes it really clear not just why the team is together, but it helps make decision making faster, because when everyone internally is on the same page, believes the same story, they can make rapid decisions. They can move much more quickly with more limited marketing funds because the story is clear. And if you think of, for example, Genentech, the story there is in business for life, really to create life. And when Roche took over, many people I talked to really said that this, they're doing the same thing internally at Genentech that they were before, but the story is different. Now we're a part of Roche. And so I think the other thing you need to keep in mind when you think of these internal stories, the founding story, the growth story, is to what degree is it coherent? And all of the stories that come out of the organization and out of the team, do they somehow create a through line, a consistent story across each of these sort of steps that they go through?
I heard this tale when Yahoo was having a lot of challenges. They were going through challenges, and so they set about trying to create a mission statement. Okay, listen, we need to focus on what's our mission statement. They had a lot of people involved. They went through a big, long process. And the person who was telling me this tale said that he was involved in the process, but he knew it had failed when a particular thing happened, and that thing was a semicolon. He said the mission statement had blah, 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 semicolon, blah, 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 blah. He said, that's not a mission statement, right? Yeah. And it's exactly your point. How do you know with precision what the what the focus is when you can't even sum it up in a single sentence? It has to be divided. So I think that that's absolutely true in everyone. And so often the message to these companies that these small companies, big companies alike is focus. Just understand and focus. The rest will come, but if you don't have focus, there isn't a hope, right? And so this is a great way to create that focus.
Absolutely. One of the things that I find is that many people who actually start harnessing story do so because the story flows organically from them. But when you start to use story strategically for an organization, it's where you have a focus, where you have a goal. This is why I'm sharing the story. So I would also underscore this idea of focus and what your goal is within the context of story. Now, the third story that we're encouraging you to think about is the story of your customer. I think companies, by and large, make the mistake of thinking they're always the hero. They come on a white horse and they save the day for the customer. But instead, if you really understand deeply your customer, you understand what their goals are. And your only role is to help them get their goal. And so if you think about Twitter, Facebook, and Google as three examples that have all created websites that are telling the stories of their customer. If you simply Google Facebook stories or YouTube stories or Twitter stories, you will come upon a great resource of essentially a repository or bank of each of these organizations telling and helping share the stories of their customers. So just drop the notion of the brand for a second and really think about what is the story of my customer and how am I enabling that story to get further, to enable your customer to achieve their own goals. A good example of this is Subway here in America. There's a sandwich shop and they can, I don't know if you call it a sandwich shop, but we'll call it a sandwich shop for a second.
Sure.
Their argument several years ago was simply, you can actually eat at Subway and lose weight. Now they can go and say, come here to lose weight, come here to lose weight, come here to lose weight, till they're blue in the face. No one's going to believe them. It's a sandwich. There's meat and there's bread. You're not going to lose weight in that.
Some cheese in there for the mix.
That's right. However, it turned out Jared, one user of a Subway, actually did have a healthy diet of Subway sandwiches and lost a tremendous amount of weight. They found his story and they spotlighted him in their marketing campaign to build their brand, and that transformed the way that users really saw Subway much more effectively than if they told their story. Do you have any examples of this?
Well, I have a company that is an enterprise software company. So this business couldn't be harder to describe in many respects. It's a company called Splunk, and what they do is they take the machine data from your systems and they create a platform that sits on top of them and allows you to extract information from all of these pieces of machine data. So your log files and your router tables, all these things. And so you say, well, how do you tell a compelling story about that? What they have done is in cities around the world now, they have what they call Splunk Live experiences, where they bring in their customers and their customers tell how they're using Splunk to create value. So a customer will sit down and say, we have one customer that has manages huge facilities, lots and lots of buildings. And they've taken all the sensor data from all of their buildings, put it into this Splunk engine, and had been able to figure out how to save a huge amount of money in electricity, in operations, in efficiency. So they tell this tale and people go, that's pretty interesting. And then someone that runs a big website comes and says, look, we took all of our traffic data, put it in here, and we can tell you which are efficient channels, which are inefficient channels. And so it takes this very technical thing and it puts it in the context of someone who has created a ton of value, and in every instance, economic value, right? Yeah. This is unambiguous. I saved money, I made the system stay up longer, I extracted costs, etc. And then what's better, someone is up in front of the audience who is representing that this has happened, who isn't from your company.
Right.
They're saying, here is how this has helped my company and made me a hero in my organization. And so it's you too could be a hero. If all you need to do is use Splunk, and you could be a hero within your organization. It's been great for me. It could be great for you. That is unbelievably powerful. And actually, I am a very firm believer now in using your customers as your evangelists and in any instance that you can. And I say this at board meetings all the time. People are tired of it. Yes, we know, David.
You might need to tell a story. I think Skype has also done a great job of starting to really tell the story. And it's not that they're telling the story, to your point, right? They're just sharing it. They're just providing the platform so that customers could do exactly what they're doing anyways, but in a larger format.
Yeah, so I have another one, just a quick one, but I have a company that I invested in called PayNearMe.
Yeah.
And PayNearMe is essentially allows you to pay cash for things that you otherwise would use a credit card for or write a check. And it turns out that 25% of the United States does not have a bank account, does not have a credit card. And so the way that they have to deal with transactions, paying bills, etc., is to show up and hand over cash. It's incredibly inefficient. And so what we've learned in PayNearMe by allowing you to pay cash at a 7-Eleven that's next door to you, to pay your bills or to buy something online, is that people who otherwise would stand an hour for 6 hours with the same group of people who all need to pay their rent on a Friday now can go 6 minutes away, not stand in line, pay in 2 minutes, and move on with their lives, right? So they have the convenience that those of us with credit cards and checking accounts all have because of this infrastructure that's been built to empower them. And I think that's really, that's what the story is about. It's not about financial transactions. It's about people who have a really inconvenient life because they haven't been empowered.
Yeah, and then they're transformed. And I think that speaks really well to this fourth story, this idea of why is this idea huge? And you could think about this as your innovation or growth story. So you can have a great founding story that brings in a great team. You could be telling your customer's story extremely well, or at least sharing it on your platform or other platforms. And yet, when you want to start growing and scaling, and it might be global, it may be from a digital perspective, you need to have another story. And that is, why is this huge? Why should everyone kind of come along for the ride? And I think Square is a fantastic example of this. Maybe you could speak to that for a little bit.
Just the idea of empowering millions of small business owners who don't have the capacity. I mean, there are all these instances in which technology has made things possible for the small business that before was not possible.
Right.
And so in the micro, you look at it and go, well, it's a small transaction, it's a small amount of money, and so why does anyone care? But in the macro, you look and say, there are millions of small business owners who are looking to be empowered. And so in this instance, it's the millions of people who are driving a taxi or selling at an art fair or have a business in their home, et cetera, who literally had the disadvantage of not being able to do online transactions, not being able to take credit cards, et cetera, and suddenly are empowered because they have a device in their pocket that has the processing power, and they have a network that's been built to take out the cost and take out the friction. And so it's empowering this. So you'd say, well, in the smallest sense, every customer is worth a very small amount of money, but in the aggregate, the customers are massive, billions of dollars in transactions. And so figuring out how to bridge that gap is really exciting.
Absolutely, and I think that this idea of being really human-centered, staying really focused on that one individual, even though that transaction is so small, but staying so human-centered, what is it that they need? And then allowing the audience that's listening to your story make the inference about the potential growth. So I wanted to kind of bring us to sort of a larger platform to pose 4 big questions to you, and then what I think we'll do is just conclude with maybe a few of your favorite tips and tricks, and also take some Q&A. Those 4 questions are: how do you use how is using stories internally within an organization important? I know we talked in chapter 2 about this idea that stories can be used to build a strong team, but there's other reasons why stories internally are really important. The second is, how can storytelling play a role in a turnaround situation? The third is, what elements does a story need to be compelling? This is a more tactical question. And the fourth and final would just be, how are stories proven mechanisms to spur action in consumers? So are any of those 4 stories at all sort of jump-started by an anecdote or 2?
Sure. No, I mean, so this question of stories being internally important, I mean, you and I have often talked about this, the idea that story is really about emotional connection, right? And people often think, oh, this is this kind of squishy thing, and it doesn't. What role does that play in business? And yet it plays a role in every instance. In why are people motivated? How do they stay engaged, et cetera? And so in Silicon Valley right now, it is incredibly competitive to get employees. To try and hire people into your organization is one of the largest challenges for a company that's doing well. Oh, we're selling lots of things, we have lots of opportunity, we just need more people. Turns out that's a massive challenge. So this emotional connection, how do you engage your future employees, your current employees, to love what they're doing, to be engaged in what they're doing, turns out to be immensely important. And I was at an organizational meeting the other day where we were talking about the value that one of the pieces of secret sauce of this company was keeping people, which seems absurd, like, oh, keeping your employees? This is some big piece of secret sauce, but it turns out the way they managed their employee base to keep the ones who knew what they were doing around was as important as trying to figure out how to bring new people in, right? So from a story standpoint, I'll tell you something that I'm obsessed with. Yeah. I've blogged about it on my blog, I've tweeted about it, and that is t-shirts. I am obsessed with company t-shirts. I think that company t-shirts are unbelievably powerful and valuable. And in the early days of Yahoo, and then you'd see this as well, even to this day in Google, if you went to the office and you walked around, every other person was wearing a Yahoo t-shirt, a Google t-shirt. It's an amazing thing, and it's a powerful thing. But the t-shirts have a message, right? Yeah. And so when I look at companies and they don't yet have company t-shirts, I say, you need a t-shirt, and they say, David, is this really a topic for the board? Absolutely. You don't understand the power of, and it's always telling the story. So, for Google and organizing the world's information, or Don't Be Evil, whether it was Splunk, which has these great t-shirts, you'll see them all over the place. Their most famous t-shirt made very clear what they did. Their t-shirt said, Splunk, taking the SH out of IT, all right? there you have it. It turns out that information technology has moments where you have a problem. These guys solve it, right?
Yeah.
Unbelievably compelling story in a t-shirt, right? And so I think that every great company should be able to sum up what is compelling and engaging about their organization and what they're doing in a shirt, and everybody should be wearing them.
I love that idea. At Ferrari, which is all about a story, right? No marketing budget. It is the story. Employees wear red uniforms, and they're so connected to these red uniforms that they wear that everyone wears them, and they wear them after work. So they don't take the uniform off and leave it at work. They go home, and the community sees them, and they're so proud about what that means. So I would encourage not just t-shirts, but think about a uniform, own a color. The color helps tell the story as well.
Yeah.
What about the role of story in turnaround situations? You got a team, you got a company, they're not doing well. How do you use story to move that?
Well, I have one company where it was it turns out that it was the story, it was an complete understanding of the business that shifted, right? And it's because this was a company that was a consumer business. You had millions of consumers who were coming to their website and using the website. But the reality was that they were also serving a set of e-commerce companies, right? That they were empowering e-commerce, sales through their website. And so for years, they thought of the consumers as their customers. Oh, we have all these consumers, and we're trying to help them, we're trying to help them get good deals on buying experiences, et cetera. And a new CEO came in and he looked at the business. He said, you know what? Consumers are going to get great deals, but our customers are actually these online e-commerce companies, right? They're the ones we're trying to help find connect with customers, bring in the right customer, et cetera. And so he changed the story. The story was empowering our partners, our e-commerce partners, to be successful with their customers. And it changed everything, completely changed the trajectory of the business, completely changed how people viewed their business, how they viewed what their goal was. Their goal was to make the e-commerce site successful, and the byproduct was happy consumers who were spending more, and then the company was making more money.
Yeah, great example. This idea of what elements does a story need to be compelling? I mean, just based on the stories that we shared in these last 45 minutes, you need to have a protagonist. Well, first you need that goal, right? Why are you telling the story in the first place? You need the protagonist. Who is the person that the audience is anchoring on, and characters around that protagonist, not dissimilar to Shakespeare. The third is you need to have a hook, or understand why would an audience even listen to you for a short period of time or a long period of time. And you really want a fourth piece, which is what do you want the audience to do after they hear the story? So rarely do we think about what do we want that audience member to do. So I would say those are 4 incredibly important elements of a good story. What would you add?
No, I think those are great. I mean, before becoming a venture capitalist, I was a litigator, and so, it turns out that litigation is all about story. You're trying to convince the courts or a jury or a set of arbitrators that you're right. And back to our earlier point about 2 + 2, you don't tell them 4, you give them the 2, and you give them the 2, and you let them then figure out what the answer is. And so it's exactly that. There's a challenge. You have a protagonist, you give them the resources to solve that problem, you drive them down a very clear path, and then you let them come to that conclusion, right? There's an incredible example here in America of this where, and it's astonishing, this must be taught now in every law school in the world, but the O.J. Simpson trial, where ultimately it was, if the glove fits, you must acquit. If you never ask a question you don't know the answer to, right? And so if they had just said, here it is, and here's and here's his glove, and here's his hand, and blah, 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 and never had him put it on, everyone sitting in the jury in the end would have said, it's clearly his glove. By giving him the opportunity to then block that and say, oh, it doesn't fit, boom, it destroyed the story. The story is, here are a set of pieces of information, here is the logical conclusion, and you yourself are so emotionally connected to it that you have to make a choice. And that's true in selling products, it's true in litigation, it's true in motivating teams on the sideline. We have a mutual friend who was an NFL football player, tells the tale of a coach, and the coach does the same thing, right? It is, we are the protagonists. The antagonists are clear. Here is our tale. And we are empowering you to go tell your own epic tale of the battle we're about to fight, right? It's always the same, and it's always compelling.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great concluding point. We can take some questions. But this idea that when stories are so compelling that it touches not just employees, but also customers, and makes customers your advocate, that's when you know you have something incredibly powerful. So on that note, what we'd like to do is open it up for a Q&A. We're also going to be posting many of the slides that we used for this webinar, along with some tips and tricks that we like, onto SlideShare. So we'll share that with the team.
So there are a couple of questions that I've seen. One of them is, how can you create a compelling personal story? What are the maybe quick things that I need to think about to capture an audience right away? This is Paul Marker, by the way.
Great. So one exercise you can do is simply write down, David and I started off with a 6-word story about each of us. Go back through your life, when you were 10 years old, 15 years old, 20 years old, etc. And just write down the 6-word story that defined your life at that time. And you start to look and say, what are the common threads among each of those stories? And that will actually, it takes 2 minutes to do that exercise, and it's incredibly informative to figure out how not only what your core story is, what are the themes across each of those very short stories, but also where you're going in the future. Because I think what people think is that they have one story. They are this one person that has this one story that's going to create this one legacy. And that's not true. The reality is that we're made up of different stories. We have research to show that our meaning of happiness shifts in very systematic ways every sort of 5 years or so. And with that comes a story, that we're living these different chapters of this overarching story. So that, I would say, is a very easy to do tip to figure out not just what your larger narrative is, but what are the micro stories that have defined your life to date and inform where you're going.
And just one quick point, which is, people often ignore their own internal motivations. They think that there has to be some external explanation, but the reality is oftentimes the most compelling thing is, why did you do this, right? People don't think that the why matters, but the why really matters in your story. Why is it you chose to go to school here? Why did you choose to start this business? Why have you become an accountant? The why matters in your story.
Just to build on that point, we spend, both from business perspective and a personal perspective, we spend so much time on the what and the how as differentiators, right? What we're doing is different. How we're doing it is different. But to your point, when you nail the why you're doing it is different, and that all coheres, you have something really powerful, and that applies to people as it does for brands.